Hi, Entrepreneur Week, and welcome back. Today we're sitting down with Sarah Dolen from Area 120 at Google to figure out what makes an idea good. And so I'm really excited for you to be here and chat with us. So maybe you can give a little bit of introduction to yourself and tell us what you do at Google.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. So I am currently at Area 120, which is part of Google. It is Google's in-house incubator. So the idea is that Google allows people to focus 20% of their time on other projects that are outside of the core scope of their job. So within Area 120, we give entrepreneurial Googlers the opportunity to pursue those 20% projects for 100% of the time. So the idea is that they come in with a great idea, we allow them to focus on it, and then that project would continue to grow and then eventually get put back into Google. So my role within Area 120 is on the investment operations side. So specifically, I'm involved in a host of things with our teams, but also helping figure out which particular ideas we want to invest in and what makes sense in terms of how it would fit back into Google.
Yeah. So this is pretty exciting. If you're a Googler, the truth is you can start and you're a software engineer doing this, that, or whatever, working on whatever team, and you can decide to come up with your own idea, go to Area 120, and you guys get to decide if that's an idea that Google wants to both invest in and then deploy out into the ecosystem that is all of Google, right?
Exactly.
So that's a pretty unique opportunity. So I guess starting off in that, how many ideas do you guys really see? I don't know how much you can talk about this, and how do you start to disseminate down to what makes an idea worth investing in at Google?
Yeah, so I cannot tell you how many ideas we see, unfortunately, or at least probably couldn't keep my job if I told you that.
I'd assume it's a lot.
It is.
You can say a lot.
A good number.
Yeah.
So in terms of what makes an idea good, the caveat here being I don't get to speak on behalf of what makes an idea good for Google so much as both through that experience and some experience that I've had previously working for a VC, I've been able to really distill out what makes a product idea a great idea. So something that may be a great idea may not necessarily be a great idea for Google or for Area 120. So let's kind of we'll focus on that.
Separate those two.
Yeah, just to make sure I'm not giving you anything I'm not supposed to give you here. But in terms of what makes an idea good, so I think about it in a couple of different buckets. The first is the problem that the idea is solving for, the product is solving for, matching that with the solution. The second piece is understanding the market and the landscape. So figuring out exactly what the differentiation looks like, what the existing competitors look like, what the existing solutions look like in the marketplace. And then understanding a little bit more about, what would the go-to-market look like? What does the value proposition look like? And so kind of focusing on those three separate areas.
Well, and so, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, and certainly I can raise my hand here and be like, the first time I tried to build something and launch it into the world, I didn't realize that validating an idea is a process, right? It is not so much as I'm going to sit down with a napkin, or in my case, I had many whiteboards that I thought I was writing out the future way that I was going to become Zuckerberg, right? And I thought that's how you created a good idea. And if you had some of your buddies in the room with you who are also very smart, you could generate that way. But what you just said is that a good idea is actually a process, right? So you get there through you said three buckets. Can you name those three buckets one more time?
Yep. So the first part being kind of how I think about the problem that's being solved, and then the solution for the product. So making sure that those two things are paired. The second piece being understanding the differentiation in the landscape, and the third piece being understanding more broadly what the go-to-market would look like, what the value proposition is.
Yeah. So let's talk about the problem in the marketplace, just as the steps. So how do you validate if there's a big enough problem for you to try and solve? What's the best way to go out and try and solve that?
Yep. So when you're thinking about the problem, there's a couple of things. One, you want to make sure that it's not just a solution in search of a problem, so that the true problem you want to both articulate, so you want to have some sort of insight into why this is a pain point that is being felt. And you want to have not only just this insight, but you want to make sure that it is something that is felt by a large enough audience or a large enough population that it's actually something that has legs, right? So if you come to me and you're like, hey, I have a great idea for dog tuxedos. I'm like, okay. But if you're like, well, I have a great idea for this, and it makes a ton of sense because there's, the wedding industry is huge. Everyone wants their dog in their wedding. And so in reality, this problem of people finding dog tuxedos is actually this huge market. And I've talked to all these people who both are, trying to plan weddings and they don't have it. And I've also talked to people who are, in the dog clothing industry. And I've realized it's this huge thing. Then you're like, okay, now I have this context for the size of the problem, the fact that this is not just something that like you as a user are feeling and extrapolating and assuming that everybody else around you is feeling, you understand that it is really truly something that is like a true validated and substantial problem in the marketplace. So that's the problem side of it. And then there's pairing it with the actual solution and the product piece, which is not only just validating that somebody wants it, but then saying, okay, now the thing that somebody wants, we have a unique solution that is differentiated and that is actually going to address this unmet user need. So it's really kind of approaching it from both of these.
Yeah. And oftentimes you want to try and figure these buckets out. You know, you're not doing one after the other, right? You're trying to figure these buckets out throughout the whole process.
Yep.
And these are the kind of questions that, you know, largely investors are going to ask you as you're, especially if you're coming with a really early idea, something that's, you know, maybe you have just put it on a napkin, right? But you haven't gone out and done some of these interviews with people who may or may not be potential customers for your dog tuxedos. If we're going to keep using dog tuxedos as the example.
I came up with that on the fly. It sounded good.
Yeah.
Saw your cute dog in the corner and was like, we're going with it.
I mean, part of me now wants a dog tuxedo. So future good idea here for Sarah is
don't steal my idea.
Dog tuxedos. So, you know, in the kind of that same vein, how much data do you think is required to go to an investor, or if you were Google or going internally to go, like, how much really do you have to quantify the size of this market and how big of a problem is before it's worthwhile maybe taking to the next step, which we'll talk about in a second?
That's a harder question because I think it depends, right? Like at each of the different stages of how you think about these ideas and how you're validating them, you're gonna have a little bit of information, you're gonna develop a hypothesis, you're gonna come back to it, you're gonna refine it, then you're gonna put it back out there, you're gonna test it again. It's not just a like, hey, I surveyed X number of people and I came back to it and, you know, realized that this was a big enough, you know, population for having enough data. It's more of this iterative process. Does that make sense?
I was going to say, you just touched on something that's incredibly important. So a good idea is a process, and a good idea is iterative, right? So as you go out and you talk to people about dog tuxedos, we're going to keep using dog tuxedos.
I'm going to regret this.
Too late now. We've done it. You know, something that's really important is as you talk to people about dog tuxedos, maybe they say, well, you know, what I really want is a really nice dog tuxedo, right? One that's made out of mohair and leather and like that's actually what I want is a really top high-end dog tuxedo, right? Okay. Well, that's iterative because maybe you didn't start with thinking about high-end dog tuxedos. Right. Most dog clothes are not high-end, to be clear. Like, so, you know, and that, again, using kind of a silly example, but like I think now you've learned something new, that there's like another part of this market segment that you didn't know about before. So anyways, I think that's cool. So idea generation, it's process, it's iterative. So now let's talk about so now that you validated that, you've gone out, you've done your research, you know that there's a market segment for this, prototyping, right? And how you actually test some of these theses. You know, in your experience, how best you start approaching that? How best you start testing some of these ideas with actual, you know, because sometimes the product isn't ready yet, right?
Right. I mean, there's a whole host of ways that you can do it. I mean, some of it is just gauging user interest. Again, talking to your potential target market segment, understanding, you know, what these needs are. If I were to provide you with this hypothetical solution, is this something you'd be interested in? So it's definitely just a lot of being on the ground, being in front of your potential buyers, your potential customers, and really understanding how they react to the thing that you're providing, like the solution you're providing them with. And then I think there's other things that you can do too a little bit later on when you know kind of think you might have something that you can put out. You can do stuff where, like, we have a product currently that did a soft release, so they announced what the product was, and then from that they were able to get a list of people who could early sign up for stuff. And so from that they were able to really quickly figure out, like, is there interest for this? And in fact, like, there are a ton of people who said, like, once you actually launch this, we want to be in there. So it's kind of different flavors of understanding who your users are, really sitting down, talking with them, understanding what they want, and then getting a sense of, like, hey, if I give this to you, will you actually do whatever the lift is to sign up and use this product, to download this product, to do whatever I need you to do it.
Well, and there's some tools out in the marketplace, not that I think this is the end all be all, and so I almost hesitate even bringing it up, but in some ways, tools like Kickstarter are a way to do this early validation. To be clear, for everyone watching this, most of the products on Kickstarters are not real products yet. So people think like, I backed this Kickstarter and one day my like cool TV that like does 3D TV and like pets me is going to happen. That's not a thing that exists today, right? That I know of.
I mean,
Yeah.
dog tuxedos and
Dog
very,
tuxedos,
very intense TVs.
very
I feel like
intense
we've
TV.
come up with 2 great ideas.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm just saying I've seen a lot of stuff on Kickstarter that I'm like, that's really great. But then I have to remind myself, like, this doesn't exist yet, right? This
I bought a 3D dinosaur puzzle on Kickstarter that in fact did exist.
Did it show up?
It did.
Oh, see, some of them do show up. The one that got me was, I don't remember, everyone remembers this one. It was the debit card that had, you could flip through your different cards. It was coin card.
Yeah.
Everyone, it didn't happen. That's the thesis of the story. No one got a coin card that worked. But the point is that Kickstarter is a great way to kind of do some of this early validation where you can put a prototype out. Most of the production in a Kickstarter is not in writing code, is not in building a physical product. It's in video editing, right? It's in describing the product. It's in throwing 3D models. Most of them, that's the truth of where that product is in that moment. And so, I don't know. How do you think about that? Is that a good tool for sort of people trying to figure out maybe how to launch a product?
I mean, I've never, aside from being a customer of Kickstarter, I've never interacted with it beyond that with my dinosaur purchase. But
the principle of it, you're validating that people want to buy
so
it.
I think what you're hitting on there that's really interesting is the ability to put a potential product in front of your user and have your user at least say, I am interested enough in this thing to put something behind it, right? So there's a difference between saying like, if I sell dog tuxedos, is it interesting? And you're like, yeah, it's interesting. Then me being like, if I sell dog tuxedos, like, will you buy one and like sign here so that you will actually buy one? So there's a little bit different like lift that has to happen where you actually have to like commit to it. And so it sounds like from what you're saying, something with Kickstarter allows you to validate. Not only are you able to put it in front of your users and get potential feedback, but you're able to say like, no, they actually would in fact pay for this thing because they are willing to. They've put money on top of this if it does come to fruition. So I think that difference and being able to like understand the real true intent to buy and like the power behind that is really important.
Well, and that's something that in any early stage startup, and again, I'm saying before you've written code or developed your product or whatever stage you're at, if you can prove without a shadow of a doubt that there is a market that is willing to pay for it, and at a minimum, like if you can just get them to straight up write a check for it, right? Figurative check.
Game on.
For a fact that you then have something.
Yep.
Now, something is kind of you don't know exactly what you've made yet, right? Because you've convinced someone that they want to pay for it. But you at least know that first hurdle of that it is worth money to someone is met. And so then it comes down to, I think, probably the next big one, which, again, hopefully you're doing as you're going through this process, which is identifying how large of a market.
Yep.
And how do you think about that? How do you think about identifying how large the market is? Because I see a lot of I see a lot of pitch decks, and they're like, this is a $6 billion market. And I'm like, no, it's not, right?
No,
but like, it's okay. I mean, you looked at it, I guess, right?
Yeah. Everybody wants to say like, it's the next Uber.
Yeah,
like,
we're going to be a unicorn, I promise, I swear.
Yeah, everyone wants to be a unicorn. So in terms of thinking about how big and then kind of the market, I want to separate those two because size is one thing and then like what the market landscape looks like is another. So size, again, like it depends, right? It depends on what your intentions are. If you want like a giant company that's going to be, potentially like an IPO, like huge company, then the market needs to be really, 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 really big.
Really big.
Depending on like what your solution is, what your product is, you want to make sure that there are enough users that are willing to buy it and that it is big enough that you think you can really run with it. And again, like I know that's kind of a squishy answer, but it really just depends on what you're selling and what you're trying to do.
Sure.
So size is less of a factor other than like from our perspective of like investing in things like you care about size. But in terms of like what makes an idea good when you're like thinking about it to start a company, I cater less towards size, think more about market differentiation, what exists in the landscape.
Well, especially in market differentiation, let's talk about that for a little bit more just for a second. So like I come from the software world myself, right? And so a lot of times when we're looking at these products early stage, it's not to say that everyone isn't its own unique little flower and it's only one that looks like that. But a lot of times somebody has either tried this and failed or has tried and is currently operating and having some mixed amount of success. So when we're looking at a new idea, it's really important to understand. I think a lot of times in a pitch deck, this will be like identifying competitors, right? Is the way that this will like lay out when you're talking to investors. But sometimes that's not even a great parallel because you're just trying to understand like how much of the landscape out there is covering the problem that you're trying to solve. And if there's too much of it, you're just going to be noise in an otherwise overly competitive marketplace.
I'd push back on a little bit of that.
Sure, yeah,
Interestingly,
push
so there's different ways to look at it, right? Like if there are a whole bunch of competitors that are currently solving this problem, but none of them have really taken a true foothold, chances are there's a reason for that, right? Like there may be something that like they just aren't doing well enough that like one has really differentiated themselves among everything else in that space. So like back to our example of dog tuxedos, because why not?
Why not? Dog tuxedos.
So if there's a whole bunch of people just providing like very generic tuxedos for dogs, you're like, okay, well, what makes it different? But if you find for some reason that a particular wool that you were talking about happens to be like the differentiator and like it's so much softer that everybody actually wants that. And so you're able to gain a market foothold because you really have this thing that is differentiated. And not only is it differentiated, but your users care about that differentiation enough to pick you over the existing people in the space. And that can be like a product thing that is different. So like in the example we used here, that's wool, that can be something about like how you deliver the product, how you build the product,
How
something
you onboard customers.
Right. It can be something about like, I can do it so I can make these tuxedos in a more effective and efficient manner so they are half the cost of the other ones in the market. It can be, you know, I can do it in a way that I can get it to my customers, whatever that thing may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be that the product is different, but there has to be something that is different enough that your consumers are like, I care about that difference. That difference helps address this unmet need that I have, and I want to use that product.
Well, it's really interesting because one of the ones that I see, and I don't think this is a new trend by any means, but especially in marketplaces that have a lot of potential competitors that you're going to go play in, ones, especially in the software world, that have like streamlined to the point of like almost too easy customer onboarding, are tend to be the winners. So when you're talking about market segments where no one's really defined themselves as the clear winner yet, sometimes just user onboarding can be the differentiator between winners and losers. Something as simple as that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We talk about, even like you talked about like winning and losing, we talk about incremental user or incremental value creation for the user. As long as you are creating additional value, those people will use that product. And so it's not necessarily like winning or losing, and like that felt like a very binary term, right? It's doing something that somehow is valued more, like creates additional, that sounds very fluffy, but like creates additional value for the person who is using it or the person who is buying it, such that that solution is just a little bit better or makes it a little bit easier or does something.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think this is important because I think a lot of, especially high school or college students or really early entrepreneurs, they think that their idea has to be so big that it's going to light the whole world on fire. And it's not ready to go launch anything until you get that. But we just talked about how you can do this incremental user validation, right? So you just have to be that much better than a competitor. You have to understand how much of the market's really being served. And probably more importantly, like, is the problem real and big enough? Because you're right. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I see out there that's a solution in search of a problem.
Yep, exactly.
Right there. So, so I guess talk to me a little bit more about, I think one of the biggest questions that comes up in really early entrepreneurship, and it has a lot of words that gets used for it, but it's about user acquisition. And so sometimes we're talking about sales, sometimes we're talking about marketing, we're talking about the intersection thereof. And especially if you're pre-product, you're pre-writing your line of code, how do you coach folks about doing user acquisition at that really early stage? Because again, we just talked about how that's so important to that validation to know that you should continue building.
Yeah. Wow. You're saving the like difficult questions for the end. That one very much depends as well based on like what the particular product is. But that said, I would think through kind of a couple of basic things. One, you want to make sure that the user acquisition isn't just like, hey, I'm buying a bunch of users, right? Like if you come to me and you're like, I want all this money because I'm going to just buy a bunch of people, and then like, I'm going to have this many monthly active users, and then they're all going to go tell their friends. You're like, hold on, wait a minute. Like there's got to be something else more to it. So really the crux of it is finding a way to get users on board and do it in a way that is efficient. So that can be something that is either like, we have a few users, they bring their friends, it's some sort of like viral loop. That can be something where it's I'm trying to think. There are a couple of different ways.
Well, there's
but
an entire science
yeah,
behind exactly
exactly.
what you're talking about too. Like that's a whole nother like 2 hour like lecture.
Yeah.
There's
There's not enough wine for that.
Yeah, there's not enough wine for that. But still, I mean, I think, I guess like, and critical mass is kind of especially very early. But I'm trying to give some sense to people listening into this talk about like, okay, so I've talked to 20 companies. I've validated that 20 companies would potentially want my product, right? And I'm now trying to figure out how to really onboard them at an early stage. Is there a better way to do that? Is there a worse way to do that? I mean, does it matter to a potential investor, or is it really just knowing that I have those potential customers who would potentially write a check? Is that enough?
So are you trying to differentiate between like truly getting these people who you have identified to use the product, or like how do I find my first 100 users?
I think I'm trying to say, how do I find my first 100 users?
First 100 users, yeah. I mean, I think again, like that really just depends, right? Like you want to understand that the way that you find your users are not just that you're buying them,
right?
And you want to understand that you're doing it in a way that is going to scale, right?
I mean, and define buying them real quick.
So just like paying for ads to get your users to click on your site and download it, or paying an influencer to market your product with a promo code so they download it, or anything that involves money in exchange for like somebody getting visibility into and actually using your product.
Right. So it's all the stuff that's outside of kind of that organic interest in your product.
So like a great example, like Blue Apron is obviously known for huge user acquisition costs that were not sustainable in terms of like people who would actually retain on the product. So you want to understand like, what does it cost to get this person on board or using this product?
And then user acquisition cost is a very real metric, especially in early stage startups to look at. So you're talking kind of outside of that, trying to understand
like how are you getting these people there, and then like once they're there, are they retaining and are they going to continue to use, or is your model for getting users like Nick comes, he buys one dog tuxedo and he never comes back again, at which point I would hope that you are not an expensive user to get, because I'm gonna have to go buy a bunch more of expensive users, versus if you are somebody who comes and like once you buy one dog tuxedo, it turns out you want 365 because your dog needs one every single day, then the chances of you being a repeat buyer and me not having to pay to get you to buy every single one of those 365 because now you're a loyal customer is much more appealing because my acquisition costs are much lower.
Right.
So understanding just kind of there's no right answer, but understanding how you're thinking about that and how you're getting there, and understanding that as somebody who is behind the product, you're thinking about how this is going to scale, because you can't just, handhold you through onboarding or do all, like once you get bigger and larger and everything else, like you can't just put a bunch of money behind it. It needs to be something that is relatively self-sustaining.
Right. So that's a question that comes up in investment conversations all the time, is then the scalability, which is certainly not this. But, and some of this also too, and, I feel like it's worth at least a footnote here, is the size of the sale certainly matters to the acquisition cost too, right? So if you're selling a solution that costs $100,000, like a $3,000 to $10,000, cost to acquire a user or a customer or whatever you're going to call them in that context, isn't, potentially that's not really that big of a cost. But if you're talking about something where, it's $9.99, right, $1,000 acquisition cost for a user, well, it's very, very unsustainable. You go to business very fast.
Suddenly you're paying me too. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so, I mean, some of this is a sliding scale when we're talking about these things, because it matters the size of the solution that you're selling too.
Yep.
And then some solutions, right, you actually don't charge the customer anything. I mean, there's a lot of situations where the customer is not the one paying that. Certainly if you look at some of our social media out in the world, you as the consumer are also the the product. So, that's something to think about too, is there's a lot of different models in which to build value around the thing, especially in the tech space.
Yeah, value is a very, very squishy thing, right? Like value can be revenue, value can be users, value can be technology, value can be anything that the person who would potentially want to buy your company or put money into, that they care about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Well, I've asked you like a ton of questions, and so I'm curious if you have any questions for me about some of this stuff, because I've just like rattled off all these questions at you about how you look at the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear I pushed back a little bit on some of your theories, but were any of those underlying hypotheses of how I think about it different than how you would think about it?
I definitely I tend to think about some of the stuff in trying to get as quick as possible to something that's testable as a product. Now, that doesn't mean like writing code. That doesn't mean like building something that you can go sell to someone per se. But I spend a lot more time really thinking about early iteration cycles on design as it relates to a way to test to customers. And so there's many more layers and many more ways to like identify market and identify some of these things. But if I know that I can put like an Envision prototype, Envision's like a clickable prototype for UX UI designs. I know that if I can like build that, put it in front of someone, again, I still haven't written a line of code, and I can get them clicking through this product, and then I can get them to a screen at the end that says, here's how much it costs to buy this, and I can get that last step where they sign up. By the way, that's the only real part that's an app. To me, a lot of times that's enough to say go. And I usually will put a little bit of marketing behind it to see how many people I can get in the hands that will go all the way through it. So I find for me personally that I'm spending a lot more time trying to validate a very, very, very early prototype as a way to identify some of these different buckets that we've been talking about. Is that the right way? I don't know. Certainly for the kind of work that we at Vinyl do, it's enough for us to say this is justifiable to build. And we've like validated with the client that, okay, you know, you have the data you need. You can make a comfortable decision to invest in a team like us to come and build that. And so I don't know. I mean, you know, do you think that so I'm racing to a prototype is what I'm trying to say, right? That tends to be the validation that I'm doing.
I mean, I think what you hit on here that's really interesting in this is it depends, right? It depends on what you're building. It depends on what your product is. It depends, like there's so many different things. And like the really interesting, unique part of a startup and like early stage processes is there's no one right way to do it, right? Like you could do your way and it could work for one thing. You could do it again and it may not work for something. Like same thing goes for my philosophy through all this. Like it really just depends. And that's what makes it so interesting and so unique is you kind of just have to figure it out, right? And it's almost like a feedback loop on itself where you're like, did what I do work? Like, should I continue doing some of these things? Should I try something else? Like, you just constantly have to be evaluating, like, how am I thinking about this? How can I improve? And just have this like really hungry hustle mindset to figure out how to just keep going and keep changing and keep improving.
Well, and you might have said the most important thing of the last 30 minutes of talking, which is that startup founders and entrepreneurs, there's almost one kind of evergreen characteristic, which is that there's grit to iterate. And so there's a lot of, you know, kind of cliches about failing fast on an idea and all these things that come up, which again could be big, long topics that we talk about. But it's to have an idea and to understand the process to iterate to make sure that you can eventually get to a product that the market segment that you've identified wants, right? That at the end of the day is the point. And I always like to leave people with this, no matter what we're building, whether it's dog tuxedos or the next great application, the truth is that when you're building anything, first and foremost in the front of your mind is that we're all trying to make someone else's life easier or better. That's why we're doing it.
Incremental value.
Yeah, incremental value. Thank you. With that, I want to thank you so much for coming down and having this conversation with us. I really appreciate you spending the time.
It's been great. Appreciate it.
Wonderful. All right, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks, Boise Entrepreneur Week.